Obesity starts with human behavior, and then it involves all the other specialties that I mentioned. So let's start with this. Let's start with an image of something that can trigger certain changes in your brain. If you imagine this cake in front of you, what is going on through your brain? What are the changes occurring through your nervous system right now that will eventually lead you to wanting to eat this cake? If you are not into cakes, perhaps this might be something more to your taste. Imagine biting into this pani puri and imagine the feeling that you might get. There are already chemical changes happening in your brain between a conversation between your brain and your stomach that will ultimately lead you to eating this. So the question that we have to ask is, to eat or not to eat? Who decides this action? I want to introduce you to the first main player of today's conversation, which is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the central driving seat in the brain that decides all your primary actions, whether it is eating, whether it is sleeping. Hypothalamus has the ultimate say in all your primary human behaviors. It is located in the center. It is located right below the cerebrum. It is located right above the pituitary gland, which is the master gland for all hormones, and right below the thalamus, which contains all the sensory inputs. The hypothalamus is closely connected to every part of the brain, and every single connection tells us a different story about our relationship with food. So if you go a little deeper, with the hypothalamus being highlighted by the red circle, every connection that the hypothalamus has talks about a different aspect. The orbitofrontal cortex, it is part of the frontal lobe. And this is the area that is responsible for telling us if this is the right time or place to do something. So if I were to give you a cake, is this the right time or place to eat this cake? The insula tells you about your own body's physiological state. If you are very hungry, you might feel that the cake should be eaten. If you've just had a 7-course meal, that cake might not be so appealing to you. The insula is responsible for telling you about your own body's physiological state. The cingulate cortex has a very interesting job. It has the job of resolving any conflict. So you might be somebody who loves to eat cake, but unfortunately, your wife or your husband is insisting that you diet. Now there is a conflict here. The cingulate cortex has to resolve this conflict. The thalamus has all the sensory inputs. So the thalamus is the part of the brain that tells the hypothalamus what it is seeing, what it is feeling, what it is hearing. So if you hear the description of a cake, if you see the cake, all that sensory input is reaching the hypothalamus through the thalamus. The temporal lobe has the job of storing memories, and it also has the job of controlling the emotions through something called as the limbic system. So the emotions that you feel when you think of a cake, the last time you had the cake, maybe it was at your birthday, maybe you were feeling very happy at that time. All those memories will come back through the temporal lobe. And finally, the brainstem is where your primary basic control of your body is taking place. So your heartbeat, your breathing, all of that is controlled by the brainstem, and the hypothalamus has a direct connection to this. Another role that the brainstem plays is in the autonomic nervous system, and an important nerve called as vagus nerve. So this is the overview of how the hypothalamus is connected to every part of the brain in context with eating. Now, we have to go a little deeper into the hypothalamus to truly understand the neuroscience of obesity. The hypothalamus contains different nuclei. We are not going to talk about all of them, but there are some nuclei which are important, which is the ventromedial nucleus and an arcuate nucleus. What is the role of this? The arcuate nucleus is in the absolute center. Right lateral to it is the ventromedial, and further lateral to it is the lateral hypothalamic area. These are the 3 areas in the hypothalamus that has the maximum role in deciding whether you eat or not. So finally, to eat or not to eat. The actuate nucleus contains orexigenic and anorexigenic neurons. Orexis is Latin for appetite or Greek for desire. So orexigenic neurons will encourage you to eat. Anorexigenic neurons will tell you don't eat. In the hypothalamus, the ventromedial hypothalamus is the part that tells you you are full, you don't need to eat anymore. The lateral hypothalamus tells you eat more. These two areas will come together to decide your eating behaviors. So this is how the brain decides whether to eat or not. Does the gut have a vote? Absolutely. That is where gut hormones come into the picture. The gut hormones is what your tummy is telling your brain. So it is a conversation between your brain and your gut. The first hormone that we will talk about is ghrelin. Ghrelin is released by the cells in the stomach. Ghrelin also causes the stomach to prepare for food. So when the stomach is empty, ghrelin is released. It goes up to the brain. It tells the brain that, listen, my stomach is empty. You need to start getting hungry. You have to seek food. This is a very primitive impulse way before human beings evolved. Even in animals, this primitive response has been designed for food-seeking behavior. If an animal doesn't seek food, it will die. So ghrelin has a primary evolutionary role to play. And as soon as you start eating, so suppose there's a burger in your tummy right now, the stomach stretches. The stretching of the stomach because of food stops the release of ghrelin. Also, why people say that drink a lot of water if you're hungry, because sometimes that hunger is just because of ghrelin, and water will stretch the stomach, stop the release of ghrelin, and you will find that, hey, you're not that hungry anymore. The other hormone to talk about is leptin. Leptin is released by the adipose tissues in the brain, and leptin suggests to the brain that now we are okay. Now there is enough of energy stored in the body, and now you can stop eating. So this seesaw between ghrelin and leptin will decide whether you are hungry or you are satiated. So when you're hungry, there is more ghrelin, less leptin. When you're satisfied, there is less ghrelin, more leptin. This is the basic connection between ghrelin and leptin and how these two combine to talk to the brain about eating habits. The overview is, of course, much more complicated. All of these hormones will go and talk to nucleus tractus solitarius, which is part of your brainstem, that is part of your vagus nerve neurons. We spoke about ghrelin, which talks to the brainstem through vagus nerve. We spoke about leptin, which comes from your adipose tissue. The other important hormones that come out is from the pancreas, which is pancreatic polypeptide, amylin, and insulin. And from your GI tract, which is peptide YY, cholecystokinin, GLP-1, and oxyntomodulin. All these different hormones go up to the brain and talk to the brain to decide appetitive behavior. Leptin reduces hunger, PPY, CCK, GLP reduces food intake, ghrelin increases food intake. The end result of the brain-gut conversation is that you are hungry. Now, neuroscience of hunger is essentially trying to answer the question, are we eating to live or are we living to eat? What is the difference? There are two main pathways of eating behavior. One is the homeostatic pathway and one is the reward pathway or the hedonic pathway. The homeostatic pathway is easy to understand. We eat to live. We eat so that we have enough energy to perform our tasks. Our body decides what is our energy storage and what is the energy requirement that we have, and accordingly decides that we need to eat so much. Here, the hypothalamus plays an important role, the ventromedial hypothalamus, leptin, ghrelin, cortisol, which comes from your adrenal gland that decides your stress levels. All of these come together to decide the homeostatic pathway. But the truth is that most of us eat for pleasure. We eat because we like to eat. We like the taste of food. This is where the reward pathway comes in. And the reason that this is so important is because evolutionarily, the brain does not take chances. Something as important as eating cannot be left to chance. We have to make sure that every species and every organism keeps looking for food. The only way to do this is to bribe itself, which is the bribe in the brain is called as dopamine. Every time the brain wants you to do something that is evolutionarily good, it rewards that action with dopamine. Dopamine goes and acts on an area in the limbic system called as nucleus accumbens. And nucleus accumbens is the area that is involved with pleasure, with feeling good. So if you bite into that cake or you bite into that pani puri, the pleasure that you get is because of dopamine hitting that nucleus accumbens spot. Unfortunately, this is also involved in addiction. So whenever you find yourself unable to stop eating, or you get that 2 a.m. craving for that cookie or that piece of cake in the ice in the fridge, the reason is that there is an addiction pathway getting activated with dopamine insisting on hitting that nucleus accumbens area. So these two pathways come together to decide as human beings whether we live to eat or we eat to live. The overview of the homeostatic and the hedonic pathways, when I showed you the picture of the cake, or when I described the cake to you, the smell, the sight, the taste, the imagination, the social context, all of this comes together to decide your personality, whether you like to eat something or not. So when you say that I like Chinese food, that has nothing to do with homeostasis. That has everything to do with your hedonic pathway. The hormones involved are opioids, dopamine, and this directly influences the cortex, your personality, your limbic system, that is your emotions, and your nucleus accumbens, which is your pleasure center. The homeostatic pathway has everything to do with energy depletion. It involves insulin and leptin, and this involves the hypothalamus and brainstem. All of this comes together to finally decide what kind of food you go out to eat, what kind of food you consume, and ultimately how you metabolize it. The overview of this whole system comes down to sensory cues and food thoughts, ultimately leading to the appetitive system. What makes you want to eat? What turns your attention? What controls your motivation? And finally, what controls your feeding behavior? Now, obesity is a vicious cycle. The more you eat, the more you want to eat. The reason for this is that when there is an energy imbalance, so you are eating more and expending energy less, it ultimately leads to more adipocytes, more weight gain, more leptin. Leptin is supposed to tell your brain to stop eating. But unfortunately, something called as leptin resistance comes into play, where the hypothalamus simply stops listening to leptin anymore. So now the hypothalamus thinks that there is not enough leptin. That means that you are not fully satiated. So that means that you should keep eating more and more. And so there is a release of neurotransmitters, and that cycle continues. We cannot talk of neuroscience of obesity without first talking about the neuroscience of cognition. The reason for this is that the most important power of the human brain is its ability to learn. When we start to learn anything, we are basically talking of neuroplasticity. So when two synapses come together to learn something new, the strength between those synapses keeps increasing. And this is neuroplasticity. We form new synapses and that connection keeps improving. The way this works is addition of newer receptors in the synapse. And one of the most important receptors that gets added is a receptor called as NMDA. Now, NMDA is one of the glutamate receptors. It reduces with age, and reducing NMDA receptors leads to memory loss and inability to learn new skills. The way NMDA works is that as you keep on learning, the reason we say practice makes man perfect is because as we keep on practicing, more and more NMDA receptors keep getting added, and that synapse gets stronger. There is a Hebbian synapse, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more you do two actions together, it forms a habit. Why is this important in obesity? One of the most important hormones in neuroplasticity is BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this is key in helping NMDA get inserted into the synapse. And leptin and ghrelin and all the gut hormones have an important role to play in BDNF production and BDNF utilization. So leptin elevates BDNF, so which means that leptin actually increases plasticity. Leptin helps you learn better. But when there is leptin resistance, which happens in obesity, the reverse actions happen. Leptin resistance is associated with impaired learning, poorer memory, and there is also a role in depression. Ghrelin also plays an important role. There is rapid reorganization of synaptic terminals in hypothalamus, and ghrelin also promotes LTP. So in obesity, when there is a mix-up or when there's an imbalance of the ghrelin-leptin ratio and there is leptin resistance, that has a direct effect in cognition. What is the brain-gut axis? It is a conversation from the gut to the brain and back. There is an effect of food on cognition. It starts even before you start to eat. The recollection of food alters emotional state of the brain. Ingestion can trigger insulin, GLP-1, it reaches hypothalamus, hippocampus, promotes synaptic plasticity. Lack of food can trigger ghrelin, which also supports synaptic plasticity. And this is one of the main reasons why fasting is recommended, because it increases ghrelin and it reduces leptin resistance. Insulin-like growth factor also has an important role to play. And vagus is the connection between gut to brain and back. Now, we have already covered cognition, emotions, hypothalamus, and gut hormones. One important aspect here is the HPA, that is hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, and the immune system. This is the holy trinity of our human behavior, which is the connection between brain, gut, and the immune system. The reason that this is important is because these are the three gateways to the body. The brain deals with outside stimulus, gut deals with outside food, and the immune system deals with outside microbes. All of them take outside information, deal with it, and it trains us how to deal with our environment. All three have defense mechanisms, and it is the Army, Navy, and Air Force of our human body. Unfortunately, all three can fail. And if one can fail, the others will fail eventually, because one system cannot fail in isolation. Overstimulation of one causes overstimulation of the others. So overstimulation of the brain is what we call as stress or anxiety. That leads to overstimulation of the immune system, which is called as inflammation, and overstimulation of the gut, which leads to obesity. This is why obesity is so closely related to stress and inflammation, and the connection between all of this is what we call as metabolic syndrome, which leads to diabetes, hypertension, stroke, cardiovascular events. All of this comes under this paradigm. I hope that I've kept the conversation in time, and I hope that you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.